primered a sudden love, the nun and the countrywoman. Sister Maria had spent 15 years behind the stone walls of the convent, believing she had buried every worldly desire beneath layers of prayer and penance. But on a frost-laden morning in early spring, when she first saw Elena kneeling in the monastery, garden with dirt under her fingernails, and tears streaking her sun-weathered face, something ancient and undeniable stirred in her chest, a feeling she had no prayer to silence, no scripture to explain away. The convent of Santa Teresa stood isolated on a hillside overlooking a patchwork of farmland in rural Andalusia, a place where time moved differently, where the modern world seemed like a distant rumor carried on the wind. Sister Maria had arrived there at 19, running from a grief so consuming it had nearly swallowed her whole. Her younger brother had died in a senseless accident, and in her desperation to make sense of the loss, she had turned to God with the fervor of the truly broken. The sisters had welcomed her, and slowly, year by year, she had built a life of routine and devotion. She rose before dawn for lauds, spent her mornings in the scriptorium illuminating manuscripts, her afternoons tending the medicinal herb garden, her evenings in contemplative prayer. It was a life of order, of purpose, of carefully maintained distance from anything that might threaten the fragile peace she had constructed. Elena came to the convent in late March, hired to restore the neglected vegetable gardens that had fallen into disrepair after the elderly. Sister Beatrice could no longer manage them. She was 42, 3 years older than Maria, with hands that knew the language of soil and seasons. She had been widowed young, her husband killed in the same farming accident that had left her childless and alone. Rather than remarry as her village expected, she had poured herself into the land, cultivating a reputation as someone who could coax life from the most stubborn earth. She wore her dark hair in a practical braid, spoke little, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that suggested she had long ago made peace with solitude. Their first encounter was unremarkable in every way except for how it made Maria feel. She had been walking the cloister path, her black habit rustling against the stone, when she noticed the new gardener kneeling by the dormant rose bushes. Elena looked up as Maria passed, and their eyes met for just a moment. But in that moment, Maria felt something crack open inside her, a sealed chamber she hadn't known existed. She hurried away, her heart pounding with what she told herself was merely surprise at seeing a stranger on the grounds. But that night, as she lay in her narrow cell listening to the wind rattle the shutters, she couldn't stop thinking about the sadness she had glimpsed in those dark eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. In the weeks that followed, Maria found herself drawn to the gardens with increasing frequency, inventing reasons to pass by where Elena worked. She told herself she was simply checking on the progress of the restoration, fulfilling her duty as the convent's herbalist to ensure the new planting scheme wouldn't interfere with her medicinal beds. But the truth, which she tried desperately to ignore, was that she simply wanted to be near this woman who moved through the world. With such quiet grace, Elena worked tirelessly, turning the compacted soil, building raised beds, creating a system of pathways and irrigation channels that would serve the convent for decades. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was low and warm, like honey poured over gravel. She spoke of the earth as though it were a living thing, deserving of respect and tenderness, and Maria found herself listening with an attention she usually reserved for scripture. One afternoon in April, after a sudden rainstorm had left the garden path slick with mud, Maria found Elena sitting on an overturned bucket, cradling her hand. She had cut it on a piece of broken pottery buried in the soil, and blood seeped through her fingers. Without thinking, Maria rushed to her side, her medical training from years of tending sick sisters taking over. She led Elena to the herb garden workroom, sat her down, and carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound. As she worked, she became acutely aware of every point of contact between them. Elena's calloused palm resting in her own, the warmth of her skin, the way her breath caught slightly when Maria applied the salve. When Maria looked up, she found Elena watching her with an expression so tender and vulnerable that it took her breath away. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, something shifted irrevocably between them. After that day, they began to talk. At first, their conversations were safe, circling around gardening and weather, and the small dramas of convent life. But gradually, like spring flowers pushing through frozen ground, they began to reveal themselves. Elena spoke of her marriage, brief and kind but never passionate, and of how she had always felt slightly out of step with the life her village expected her to live. Maria, in turn, found herself confessing doubts she had never voiced to her. Confess her how sometimes her prayers felt like words echoing in an empty room. How she feared she had chosen the convent, not out of true calling but out of cowardice, a way to hide from a world that had wounded her too deeply. Elena listened without judgment, her presence a kind of sanctuary Maria had never experienced even within the sacred walls she called home. The more time they spent together, the more impossible it became for Maria to deny what was happening. She was falling in love, and the realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Everything she had been taught told her this was wrong, a violation of her vows, a sin against God and nature. She spent hours on her knees in the chapel, begging for the strength to turn away from these feelings, to see Elena as simply another soul in God's creation, and nothing more. But her heart, which had been silent for so long, had finally found its voice, and it would not be quieted. She began to understand that what she felt for Elena was not a temptation to be resisted but a truth to be reckoned with, a fundamental part of who she was that no amount of prayer or denial could erase. Elena, too, was struggling. She had recognized her own nature years ago, had learned to live with the loneliness of keeping that part of herself hidden in a small village where such things were not spoken of, let alone accepted. When she had taken the job at the convent, she had expected the familiar solitude of working alone with the earth. She had not expected to meet someone like Maria, intelligent, compassionate, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the quality of light that seemed to emanate from her. Elena knew the danger of what was developing between them. She knew that Maria's whole life, her identity, her community, were tied to vows that could not accommodate love like theirs. But she also knew that some kinds of love, once awakened, could not be sent back to sleep. One evening in May, as the sun set in streaks of gold and rose over the hills, Maria found Elena sitting on the garden wall, looking out over the valley. Maria sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, Elena turned to her and said that she would be finishing the garden project soon, that it was time for her to move on to other work. Her voice was steady, but Maria could hear the pain beneath it, the same pain that was tearing through her own chest. Maria reached out and took Elena's hand, something she had never dared to do before, and felt Elena's fingers close around hers with desperate strength. In that moment, with the evening light washing over them and the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, Maria understood that she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. If this story is touching your heart, if you believe in the courage it takes to love against all odds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of love that dares to exist in a world that often tries to deny it. Thank you for being here. The weeks that followed were the most agonizing of Maria's life. She continued her duties, attended prayers, moved through the familiar rhythms of convent life, but everything felt hollow now, a performance she was giving for an audience that no longer mattered. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not concentrate on anything but the impossible equation of her situation. To pursue her feelings for Elena meant leaving the only home and family she had known for 15 years, abandoning vows she had made before God, stepping out into a world she was no longer equipped to navigate. But to deny those feelings meant sentencing herself to a lifetime of grief for what might have been, killing the truest part of herself to preserve a life that had never quite fit. She sought counsel from Mother Superior, a woman in her 70s who had led the convent with wisdom and compassion for decades. Maria did not confess the specifics of her struggle, but she spoke in careful abstractions about feeling called in a direction that conflicted with her vows. Mother Superior listened in silence, her weathered hands folded in her lap, and when Maria finished speaking, the old woman was quiet for so long that Maria feared she had already been condemned. But when Mother Superior finally spoke, her words were unexpected. She said that God's love was vast and mysterious, that it moved in ways the human heart could barely comprehend, and that sometimes our most sacred duty was not to the vows we had made in our youth, but to the truth that revealed itself as we grew. She said that a life lived in denial of one's deepest nature was not a gift to God, but a rejection of the self God had created. She did not tell Maria what to do, but she gave her blessing to whatever path Maria chose, and in doing so gave her permission to trust her own heart. On a warm night in June, when the garden Elena had created was flourishing with new life, Maria walked out of the convent carrying only a small bag of possessions and a heart both broken and whole. Elena was waiting at the garden gate, just as they had planned, and when Maria saw her standing there in the moonlight, she knew with absolute certainty that she was making the right choice. They left together, two women who had found in each other what the world had tried to convince them didn't exist, a love that was neither forbidden nor wrong, but simply beautifully, undeniably true. If you've stayed with this story until the end, if it has moved you in any way, I have a small request. Please take a moment to leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you. Your words matter more than you know, and they help create a community where stories like this can be told and celebrated. They settled in a coastal town where no one knew their histories, where they could build a life as two friends who happened to share a home. Maria found work at a bookshop, rediscovering her love of literature outside the confines of religious texts. Elena started a garden design business, and together they cultivated not just plants but a life of quiet contentment. There were difficult days, moments when Maria grieved what she had left behind, times when Elena worried they would be discovered and judged. But there were also mornings waking up to sunlight streaming through their window, evenings cooking dinner together in their small kitchen, nights falling asleep to the sound of each other's breathing. They learned that love, real love, was not the dramatic passion of novels but the daily choice to see and honor each other, to build something tender and resilient in a world that often felt hostile to its existence. Years later, Maria would sometimes think back to that spring morning when she first saw Elena in the garden, and she would marvel at how a single moment could alter the entire trajectory of a life. She had thought she was choosing safety when she entered the convent, but she had really been choosing fear. It was only when she found the courage to love Elena that she truly understood what it meant to have faith, not faith in doctrine or institution, but faith in the voice of her own heart. Faith that love, in whatever form it takes, is always sacred, always worthy, always enough. And on quiet evenings, when she and Elena sat together, watching the sunset paint the sea in impossible colors, Maria would reach for Elena's hand and feel, finally, profoundly, completely at peace.